Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents It Ain't Heavy, It's My Story. My Life in the Hollies, by Bobby Elliott. Narrated by Shaun Grindell. Introduction. I stood in front of New York's world-famous Paramount Theatre and drank in the sight. Here we were, right in the heart of Theatreland in Times Square, about to perform in the theatre designed to showcase the best of Paramount Pictures, and now a top-notch live performance venue. We had made it to the States. Stars like Ginger Rogers, Rudy Vallee and Bing Crosby had performed in this theatre. It was here that the crowds had danced in the aisles to Benny Goodman's music, with the great Gene Krupa on drums, and here that the Bobby Soxers had squealed and cried over Frank Sinatra. As the heavy stage door closed behind me, I skipped up the short flight of concrete steps leading to the elevator. It was then that I heard raised voices. The sight of a group of theatre staff fronted by a tubby New York cop, pistol drawn, stopped me in my tracks. Those little white girls out there loved me. It was little Richard, and he was in real tutti-frutti tantrum mode. The police officer appeared agitated and was now sticking the loaded weapon into my hero's neck. It was tense. "Hold still or I'll blow your fucking head off," ordered the officer. Undaunted by the cold steel being poked into his jugular, little Richard's outpourings continued in a sort of running-on-the-spot fashion. I was witnessing a serious incident, a surreal tragicomedy. Was I on a film set? Would someone shout cut? Chapter 1. Pearl Harbor. Britain had been at war with Germany for over a year. My father, Bob Elliott, and his best friend Ted Shaw approached the saloon bar in the Talbot pub and ordered a couple of pints of locally brewed Massey's ale. There were many similar watering holes dotted around Burnley, a small cotton mill town which nestled, along with Nelson and Colne, in the shadow of Pendle Hill in Lancashire, not far from the Yorkshire border. Tall chimneys, each of them close to 300 feet high, dominated the landscape, belching smoke and cloaking the town in smog and grime. Far below were thousands of clog-wearing weavers, each of whom operated 8 or sometimes 16 clattering looms in the mills. The noise was deafening, and they communicated with one another in sign language. Despite this, they were a cheery bunch of folk who lived mostly within walking distance of the stone-built mills, known locally as sheds, in street after street of small terraced houses. In the pub that night there was a modest celebration. I had just been born at the nearby nursing home, and my dad and Ted had been to see mother and baby. As the beer flowed, the pub wireless crackled out the news that Japanese torpedo bombers had attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet, lying peacefully at anchor in Pearl Harbor, killing thousands of U.S. sailors and servicemen. It meant that the Americans had been drawn into the conflict, resulting in a full-blown World War II. Throughout his life, my dear father would remind me of this fact every time war in the Pacific was mentioned. "Pearl Harbor, that's when you were born, Robert." Actually, the attack happened on December 7th, Pacific time, but the news reached the British public the following day. As the evening ended, the two revellers drank up and made their way up Ormerod Road, past the College of Knowledge, as Burnley College was always known, over the Leeds to Liverpool Canal by way of Goodley Bridge, along the iron railings that skirted Thompson Park and Queen's Park, and along the ridge that looked down onto Turf Moor, the town's football ground. Those railings are still in place today, but sadly most of the ornate Victorian metal fencing had been cut down in 1940 to be turned into tanks and guns to fight the Germans. Well, that was the plan. The good folk of Burnley watched helplessly as fences were torn from their little terraced gardens by men armed with oxyacetylene torches. Throughout the country, churches and public buildings were shorn of their wrought iron glory. At the time, the people of Britain were told that the metal would be melted down to build war-winning munitions, but their sacrifice was in vain. Part way through this act of vandalism, our leaders were informed that it was the wrong sort of metal. What the arms industry really needed was quality Sheffield steel, not wrought iron. The nation had been duped, but, keen not to lose face, the authorities carried on picking clean our crafted heritage, even though they knew it was not fit for the purpose. In a final, desperate act of deception, the national stockpile of plundered railings was secretly dumped at sea under cover of darkness, and the general public, none the wiser, carried on proudly believing that they had helped to win the war by donating their ironware. Dad and Ted couldn't see much as they headed for Pike Hill, an elevated suburb on the town's outskirts. It was the age of the blackout. Hitler's Heinkels and Dorniers were in the skies, looking for somewhere to drop their lethal high-explosive bombs. To thwart this threat, every streetlight in the country had been turned off. Vehicle headlights were covered, and blackout cloth was fitted to the windows of every household in the land. Home was 13 Chiltern Avenue, a modest, semi-detached house where Dad lived with my mum, Edna. I was to be their only child. Dad was 32 when I was born, and Mum was 5 years younger. Dad and his brother Jack were master cabinet makers. They crafted hand-built furniture. Their company letterhead proclaimed H. Elliott, furniture manufacturer. It was a family business, inherited from their father, Hartley Elliott. I never knew my grandfather. He died penniless 8 years before I was born, leaving his 2 sons in debt and saddled with a crumbling rented building that dated back to the Industrial Revolution and was equipped with ancient woodworking machinery and not much else. It seems that Hartley had been a colourful character, always immaculately dressed, who spent most of his life playing chess with local, wealthier businessmen in the Mechanics' Institute. He had grand ideas, and he liked to show off. As a young man, he'd had a furniture factory built in nearby Nelson, complete with a high mill chimney. When the work was completed, rumour has it that Grandad performed a headstand on top of the newly erected smokestack. Hartley had been married twice and had sired 9 children, Jack and Dad being the final 2 from his second wife. The old boy was an early riser, and at dawn he would enter Jack and Bob's bedroom, throw back the curtains, open the windows and bellow, "Waken, lords and ladies gay, to the mountain dawns the day. All the jolly chase is here with hawk and horse and hunting spear." In the early days of the war, Britain was fighting for its life against Hitler's hordes, and my father and uncle were doing their bit. By night they kept the family business going by making chests of drawers and sideboards for local customers. By day they made parts for the Horsa troop-carrying gliders, and later plywood sections for the twin-engine Mosquito fighter bomber at the local joinery firm of Earnshaw Brothers and Booth. The wood and canvas flying machines would be used in the invasion of mainland Europe. The plan was that they would carry British soldiers across the Channel to France, hauled by obsolete RAF bombers or American DC-3 Dakota transport aircraft. On reaching their target zones, the gliders would release themselves from the tow plane's cable, and the soldiers at the controls would, hopefully, land safely on a flat, smooth field in pitch darkness, praying that the Germans hadn't seen them. Unknown to Herr Hitler, hidden away in towns throughout Britain, workers were beavering away, manufacturing whatever was needed to keep the Third Reich at bay. Probably the best example was at nearby Barnoldswick, where, tucked away in old cotton mills, Rolls-Royce was quietly making aero engines for Spitfires and Lancasters, while Frank Whittle and his team were secretly developing the jet engine. My dad was also a fine motorcyclist and was recruited as a dispatch rider for the Home Guard. He held down 3 jobs in the grim days of World War II. In the 1940s, the view from our front garden on Chiltern Avenue was quite impressive. The hillside sloped down to the pastoral expanse of Townley homes, with the grand 500-year-old hall and woodlands to the left, contrasting with the dozens of smoking mill chimneys to the right. I remember hearing the distant clank of the steam-powered freight trains as they coasted down the valley behind the old hall, sounding like a wheezing old man with a wooden leg walking down a passageway. The locomotive would later return from Rose Grove sidings, hauling a rake of fully loaded wagons, struggling and snorting, wheels spinning, as driver and fireman attempted to get it up the steep incline, heading up to Copy Pit, Windy Bridge and beyond. As for me, I was safely tucked away in number 13. One of my first memories is of my Auntie Irene, who was actually my cousin, the daughter of Mum's sister, Margaret, singing "I'll Be Your Sweetheart" or "Bicycle Built for Two" as she rocked me in her arms. Who knows, maybe those mesmerizing lullaby moments sparked my lifelong craving for melody and music, and rhythm. I vaguely remember the roar of something overhead, and I was later told it was a low-flying German fighter plane making a dash back to its Luftwaffe base in Europe. At an early age, I was sent to Todmorden Road Junior School in Burnley. It was a brief, unhappy experience. The big stone building seemed scary and far too full of people, and as soon as I got inside, I knew I had to get out of there. When playtime ended, I decided to escape from the playground by climbing over the surviving iron railings, and I set off in search of Auntie Irene. I knew that she worked near Townley Holmes in the Co-op laundry, about a quarter of a mile away. I made it, but I only used that trick once or twice, as Irene would, duty-bound, walk me back to my classroom or escort me home. Another ploy was to leave home for school as normal in the morning, and then hang around the streets, waiting until the other kids were going home, at which point I'd board the same bus, arriving back at number 13 as though nothing had happened. It was a long, lonely day. Once I went up Chiltern Avenue and concealed myself round the back of our house, planning to make an entrance at the appropriate time and pretend that I'd had a full day in class. Meanwhile, a worried teacher had walked up Pike Hill in search of the runaway pupil and arrived at our door. My mother insisted that I'd gone to school like a good boy and was most definitely not in the house. But, unbeknown to my poor mum, I'd come in quietly through the back door and was peering round the corner, in full view of the bemused teacher. Around that time, Sally's grocery shop at 1 Brownside Road, Pike Hill, came up for sale. It was just round the corner from Chiltern Avenue, and Mum reckoned she could run the shop and make some extra income, so my parents bought it. Our new home was a semi-detached bungalow with a dormer bedroom above, ideal for me and my train set, and later my Meccano drum set. The shop in the front was a compact confectioner's and grocery store. We moved in at the end of the war. At that time there was no refrigerator to keep food fresh. During one summer's heatwave, Mum suspended a huge block of butter over a bath of cold water to prevent it from melting. Mum's father, Alfred Precious, lived next door at number 3. Alf was the local plumber and was assisted by his son Tommy. The pair of them would be seen pushing their 2-wheeled flatbed handcart around the parish, fixing this and that or replacing broken windows. A very useful neighbourhood service, especially when I had been playing football on Thornton Road or throwing snowballs at other kids. Grandad Alf was a good clog dancer. He had rhythm in his old bones. He looked like Buddy Ebsen's character Jed Clampett in the Beverly Hillbillies. He wore a battered hat and sported a moustache that I joked was for filtering tea leaves from his mug as he supped his brew. Alf's wife Florence, my grandma Precious, had died when I was very small, so I don't really remember her. But I do remember the house going very quiet at Christmas when she died. Alf never slept in their bedroom again, choosing instead to sleep in the small back storeroom. I liked to quietly observe him as he sat in his armchair, listening to music on the radio, hands on the chair arms, tapping out the beat with his arched thumbs like mine. He was a lovely man, who often neglected to send bills out for jobs that he and Uncle Tommy had done. Mum heard from one of their customers that Alf and Tom had completed work on their property months earlier, and yet they had never received a bill. Each evening when Mum closed the shop at 7 p.m, Mum would be off next door to reprimand her dad and then set about sorting out his business affairs. Every Wednesday, her sisters, Margaret and Nellie, who had been cotton weavers but were now dinner ladies in one of the mill's canteens, would come up to Pike Hill after work and cook fish and chips for their dad. Next door, Mum would be busy serving in the shop while trying to make my dad's evening meal in the family kitchen. I would make a tin of beans from the shop, pop next door and join Alf, Nellie and Margaret to happily dine on my favourite dish of Heinz baked beans and chips. Back at Edna's, as the locals now referred to Mum's shop, one of the customers heard about Robert's running away problem and recommended that I be sent to St. John's Church School at Holme in Cliviger, about 3 miles away. It was a good move. Now I was settled in a much smaller school, and I was happy there. The old BCN, the Burnley, Colne and Nelson Joint Transport, AEC single-decker bus, number 149 or 150, would whisk me from Pike Hill right to the front door of the school. At first I went home for dinner, or lunch as we call it now, but Mum was usually busy serving behind the shop counter, and it was difficult for her to cook food for me and look after her customers. It was decided that I would stay for school dinners. I didn't really mind, as I was now happy in my surroundings with my new-found friends. There was no kitchen at our school, so the freshly made dinners had to be brought from the next village of Cliviger. The food was put into containers and loaded onto the Burnley to Todmorden bus that would then transport the dish of the day, which might be mashed potatoes and mince, followed by rice pudding, topped with a blob of jam, a couple of miles up the road to us hungry kids. Being chosen for dinner duty was the highlight of my school day. It was a carefully organised event that had to run like clockwork. I would stand by the bus stop with a classmate, and we'd be craning our necks for the first sight of the big green and cream corporation bus, as it rumbled up the incline en route to Todmorden. As the double-decker approached, we'd hold out our arms to make sure that our mash and gravy didn't end up in the wrong hands. When the bus had stopped, the conductor would signal permission for us to board the rear platform. Once aboard, we'd lift the food from the luggage area under the stairs and place each large circular canister carefully by the roadside. There was a handle on each of the containers, so we would carefully synchronize our lifting technique to ensure that no food was spilled. Sometimes the odd folded pram or suitcase got in our way, but we were skilled operators. Once the deck was clear, we would give the bus conductor the nod, and, with a cheery ding, the diesel-powered omnibus went on its way. After that, we had to make several journeys on foot until all the containers were inside the school, ready to be served when the bell rang signalling lunchtime. Next came dog dinner duty. This was a means of disposing of the unwanted scraps left over from lunch. The ram inn across the road was also a working farm. Round the back of the pub lived a sheepdog in a kennel. We would take it in turns to carry the bowl of leftovers across the busy road and round to where the dog lived. He had a length of chain attached to his collar, and the other end fixed to the kennel. There was an art to this. Get too close and Shep could nip you. Too far away and his chain wouldn't allow him to enjoy his grub. You had to place the container as close to doggy as you dared, then carefully tow him the food into his comfort zone. Good dog. Bon appetit. A large field served as an extended playground, and had been marked out with roads by generations of kids' feet. But we also had the freedom of the village during our lunch break. One of the main railway lines from Lancashire to Yorkshire ran down the valley, just across the fields from school. On a hot summer's day, my pals and I would venture down the lane and end up to the path that crossed the tracks. We'd place pennies on the steel rails and wait for the Todmorden to Burnley train to run over them. The wheels of the heavy locomotive would compress and contort the copper coins. Then we'd retrieve the bent discs of metal, dash back to school and gleefully show our spoils to the other children. Mrs. Clarkson was a fine headmistress. She lived just down the road from Mum's shop in the bottom bungalow. Each Wednesday she and the other two teachers would shepherd the whole school up the pathway, past the tomb of General Scarlett, and into St. John's Church, where Canon Edwards would preach, and we would sing a few hymns. I don't remember the sermons, but the sound of the voices of my little school chums filling the old place with haunting melodies served as an early stepping stone as I started out on my musical journey. Mum and Dad would select long-playing records, known as LPs, from Burnley Library, just like borrowing a book. The works of Gilbert and Sullivan, Grieg's Piano Concerto, and even the opera Merry England would spin on our radiogram turntable, after Mum had cashed up the day's takings and put the close sign on the shop door. I still have Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto on 12-inch 78s that my parents bought, and Litov's Scherzo on two sides of a 10-inch 78. The latter jigged along merrily, enabling me to join in and funk it up on a Cadbury's Roses tin, armed with my makeshift drumsticks. These forms of music were important in young Robert's musical development and helped map my way forward to the next port of call, the soon-to-be-discovered land of jazz. Pike Hill was surrounded by farmland and rambling expanses of moorland. The River Brun ran down from the peat moors above the hamlet of Hurstwood, and in summer, along with the other lads, we would construct dams to form swimming pools. In winter we had the Brownside sledging tracks, the Big Dipper and the Skeleton, where we would test our skills to see who had the fastest sleigh. I was lucky. I had a dad who could make things out of wood, and I still have the sledge that he built for me all those years ago. Many a time, intent on being the fastest, I would be unable to stop at the bottom of the icy slopes and end up in the freezing river. Being very young, I was wearing short pants and Wellington boots as I travelled head first, no hard hat protection in those days, down the snowbound track. My wellies would scoop up snow, so that at the end of each run I had to empty them out. After a few speedy descents, I'd trail up Brownside Hill, dragging my iron-shod conveyance homeward. Once inside, I'd stand in front of the blazing coal fire and squeal in pain as my mum rubbed snow-fire ointment on the red, raw rings of flesh caused by my flapping boot-tops. Chapter 2. Nights at the Turntable. During the war, an American B-24 Liberator bomber had crashed up on the moors, and some of the villagers had collected souvenirs. I was told by one of the older boys that shortly after the crash, a local character had managed to get the radio out of the aircraft, and the guy was seen sitting in a ditch shouting into the microphone, "Hitler, you bastard!" One boy, prompted by his dad, organised us into a ragtag group of scrap dealers. We took it in turns to saw off the exposed propeller blades, or smash off a cylinder head on the Pratt & Whitney Wasp radial engines. The scrap was diligently carried across the moors and loaded into Eric Lord's handcart, which rode on 2 aircraft rear landing wheels. The plundered metal alloy was then pushed all the way down to Reeder's scrapyard in Burnley. It was a long way, so I pulled off at Pike Hill, more interested in getting home than in the few shillings on offer when the metal was sold. The war ended in 1945, and I can vaguely remember the Pike Hillers lighting a bonfire and burning an effigy of Hitler on open land off Delmer Road, near John Driver's farm. Food was rationed, and each week Mum had to perform the time-consuming, unpaid task of counting every coupon that she'd taken from each customer's ration book. This went on until the early 1950s, when I remember the locals queuing across the road at Green's the greengrocer's for the first bananas to arrive. None of us kids had ever seen one before. Auntie Margaret and Uncle Fred lived on Glebe Street in Burnley, and when my parents were going out to a late dance, or do, I would sleep there. I must have been about 5 or 6 years old. I can remember the rat-a-tat on my bedroom window in the early morning from the knocker-upper, a chap who carried a long pole with a springy piece of tin fixed to the end. He woke the workers of Burnley Wood by tapping on their upstairs windows. Most of the cotton weavers paid him a shilling or so a week to be woken in this way, and a few minutes later I would hear the sound of doors opening and closing, and the click-clack of folk in their iron-soled clogs hurrying down to the mills to operate the noisy cotton-weaving looms. By the 1950s, television had arrived in Britain, but for some reason or other we didn't have a TV set in the family living quarters behind the shop. One of the neighbours got one, and I remember Mum closed the shop so that she could pop round to watch the Queen's coronation at Jessie Hindle's. The Hindle brothers owned some disused mills stuffed with war surplus equipment, and I would go to play there with my chum, Alan Hindle. His dad Clifford would drive us to Cornholm in his American Chevrolet convertible. While he took care of business, Alan and I would explore the old buildings, finding pile upon pile of wooden US Army boxes. Some contained radar spares, clock gauges or tools. One section consisted of tins of foot powder. We'd unscrew the caps, pretend they were hand grenades, and bomb one another as we hid behind the stacks of surplus war gear. As the canisters hit, plumes of white powder would explode, and we'd stagger out of the warehouse looking like a couple of ghosts. In another building sat an abandoned American Allison airplane engine. The US Mustang fighter was first fitted with the Allison, and it was a poor performer. Then someone suggested the plane should be fitted with the latest British Rolls-Royce Merlin motor, and arguably the best fighter escort plane of World War II was born. I was about 11 years old when I joined the Burnley ATC, Air Training Corps, 352 Squadron. We would meet on Thursday evenings at HQ in Burnley in our little RAF-style uniforms, berets set at a jaunty angle. I was good at aircraft recognition and was picked to go to summer camp at RAF St Athan in South Wales. The highlight of the week was a ride in a piston-engine chipmunk trainer, during which the pilot would give his lucky passenger the thrilling experience of looping the loop. Auntie Irene's husband, Terry Flynn, had been a member of RAF ground crew during the war. His job was to keep the Lancaster bombers in airworthy condition. I loved to listen to his stories in their home in Dole Street, Burnley. He had built, with incredible precision and skill, the perfect model of a Spitfire out of bits of wood and scrap while he waited for the aircraft to return from their German bombing missions. With a wingspan of just 9 inches, the little fighter plane sported the same camouflage paint as those World War II machines, and every time I was in Terry's house I would look at it in wonder. As I write this, that same Spitfire is still with me, suspended over my desk. When Terry passed away, Irene insisted I have it. I developed a passion for steam trains and aircraft. Tagging along with some of the older boys from Pike Hill, I would catch the train from Burnley Central to Preston, where we could see the big West Coast LMS locomotives, the Royal Scot or the Midday Scot, as they cruised through the mainline railway station. Beautiful, blinkered big beasts with names like Duchess of Montrose and City of Carlisle, hauling maybe a dozen crimson or strawberry and cream liveried coaches. Dad was a keen ornithologist, and he and Mum would set off in our maroon MG saloon to nearby beauty spots like the Yorkshire Dales, the Trough of Bowland, Leighton Moss, or the Lake District. I thought the birdlark a tad boring, so I would ask my parents to drop me off at the small station at Hest Bank, on the busy London to Glasgow line, where I would happily spend the day jotting down the names and numbers of locos until Edna and Bob collected me on their way home. If we holidayed in Llandudno, they would drop me at Llandudno Junction. In Torquay, they would leave me overlooking Newton Abbot Station, and I would enjoy a feast of steaming Great Western green goddesses. We also had September holidays in a static caravan near Bournemouth, so I persuaded Dad to drive me down by way of the Farnborough Air Show. In those days, test pilots would show their flying machines with great skill, using every trick in the book to sell their company's aircraft. Back then it was a showcase only for British-manufactured planes. Dozens of glistening silver shapes would take turns trying to impress the huge crowds, in the days when British aircraft technology led the world. On Saturdays I would go to Auntie Margaret's to watch her TV. I'd stay for tea and then catch the bus that came down from Townley and into Burnley. Under the culvert, the aqueduct that carries the Leeds to Liverpool Canal, I'd hop off, dash across the road and catch another BCM bus that was heading to Worsthorne by way of my home at Pike Hill. Once upstairs, I'd head for the front seat. Every time I made the journey from my auntie's, I would see Joan Parker, a pretty girl of 13, sitting at the back of the bus. It was 1956, I was 14, and that was the first time I realised I was strongly attracted to the opposite sex. As the weeks went by, I plucked up the courage to ask Joan if she would go to the Odeon cinema with me one Friday night after school. She agreed, and we sat in the expensive seats downstairs on the back row. The feature film was Partners, starring Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, and, as we watched, I actually built up enough courage to put my arm around Joan. In my innocence, I thought it was the best feeling ever. I felt proud and grown up. I still remember her sweet smell and soft skin. After that, we would go for walks in the countryside around Worsthorne, and sometimes her friend Eileen Whitehead would come along. After a while, Joan and I drifted apart, and I became besotted with Eileen. Both girls were at Nelson Grammar, making it easy for me to meet up with Eileen and walk her home after class. The first time I took her to the movies, we went to the Palace Cinema in Burnley Centre. The film was a comedy, You Can't Run Away From It, starring Jack Lemmon and June Allison. Eileen lived above her parents' chip shop on Clayton Street in Nelson, but she spent some of the week at her grandma's in Worsthorne. She was cheeky, confident and horny. I was totally hooked. We went out together for about 3 months, and I was heartbroken when she dumped me and began seeing a more mature guy who was a painter and decorator. I'd passed my 11+, a contentious exam that decided at the age of 11 whether or not you would go to a grammar school. If you failed, then it was a comprehensive school. I got my green and yellow uniform, cap and leather satchel, and travelled on 2 buses in order to get to Nelson Grammar School. There was a 10-minute wait in Burnley Centre before the school bus arrived. This gave me the chance to pop round the corner and look in the window of the Electron record shop. There I would excitedly view the latest LPs on display. From 1953 to 1957, I watched the fast-changing face of modern music displayed in that window, from Frankie Lane and Doris Day through to Bill Haley and Elvis, with a touch of Mel Torme, Jerry Mulligan, and one of the most striking LP sleeves of all time, the atomic Mr. Basie. Before I found jazz, at the age of 10 or 11, my exposure to music had been a mixed bag. My parents loved classical music, and they would borrow records from Burnley Library. They loved piano concertos by composers like Rachmaninoff, Grieg, and Litthoff. There would be a sprinkling of Gilbert and Sullivan and songs from the shows. I knew most of the music by heart. Mum would la-la her current favourite in the car or around the house and shop, and Dad would join in with a cheery whistle. When I was still quite small, they took me to the King George's Hall in Blackburn to see the Liverpool Philharmonic and the great concert pianist Benno Mosevich perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto. Dad reckoned that concert was a pivotal moment for me. He was right. It wasn't just the gifted soloist that took my eye. It was the percussionist playing the crescent of tuned timpani. We were sitting round the back of the orchestra, right next to him, and I remember watching his every move, enthralled by the constant adjusting and damping of the timps. Around that time, my Uncle Terry would play Glenn Miller 78s to me, the St. Louis Blues March, American Patrol, and the trumpet solo from A String of Pearls. He also had several wacky comedy records by Spike Jones and his City Slickers, which...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?